So friends, it's a pleasure to see you. I think there are probably better things to do with a Saturday evening than come listen to me. So I'm grateful that you all made the time. What I thought I'd talk to you about is what is really actually occupying my mind and heart more than anything else. It is a concern about middle class indifference to inequality and injustice in my own country, and in many ways it's the story of almost every country on the planet. But I will talk about India. Marcus, in his recent book, The Idea of Justice, asks a very interesting question. He asks why is it that every human society has seen contains injustice, but it also contains efforts to alter that situation with justice, something that is universal to every human society through history. So the question that he asked, that I'm asking here, is that why is it that human beings have always sought to change social arrangements in a way that makes society more just? What Amartya Sen says is that there are three things central to human nature which makes this universal. And the first and in my mind the most significant is the quality of empathy. Empathy is as you understand, empathy is an act both of, it's first an act of imagination. It is the ability to imagine what another person is going through, and then it is an act of feeling, and it is feeling what that other person is undergoing. And therefore, and so he says, so empathy is central to human nature. And then two other things, incidentally, which is the love of freedom and reason. And it is these three elements of being human which drives human societies to search for greater justice. There was a particular moment last December when there was the gang rape in Delhi, at a place Delhi, 3 kilometers from where I live. And it was a very special moment because for a woman whose face we do not know still, a woman whose name we don't know, there was a sense, it was a very rare moment of public empathy. When people came out onto the streets, the day she died, I had also gone to Jantar Mantar, and many young people who were sitting around with candles. From their faces, you got a sense of it was like somebody they knew whom they loved had died. And died unjustly. And that is why it was a very special moment, because it was a moment of empathy. I think, in a very sort of almost class book sense, it is that empathy that drove the demand for justice, which forced the government to set up a committee, and ideas that feminist movements have been throwing out for the last 30, 40 years suddenly got culminated and the law changed. And in that sense, we saw a very clear movement from empathy to greater justice. But it set me thinking a great deal about, whereas I was happy to see that movement of public caring and empathy, I also saw the limits to that empathy. Somewhere we cared about her because she was like us. I work with homeless people, that's one of the things that I do. And probably women who suffer the greatest amount of unmitigated violence or in the same city is homeless women. These are women who, when we set up our first shelter for homeless women, I recall asking them what had changed most in their lives. And there was this woman who said, it was the first time in 17 years when I closed my eyes at night, I was sure that no one is going to rape me through the night. And it just, I realized, among people we know, God forbid, if somebody has to undergo one such experience, it would scar you for life. If it's something that happens to you night after night for 17 years, but there are no candlelight marches for shelters, most elementary shelters for homeless women. Dalit women are routinely subjected to violence. There's violence in conflict areas. There's every criminal riot, but particularly the 2002 violence in Gujarat. So the most extreme forms of sexual violence. Areas affected by militancy. I recently gone to a place called Gulam Bushpara, a village in Kashmir, where 22 years ago there was an instance of, probably the largest instance of gang rape of an entire women in the entire village during the height of Kashmir militancy. And they have not found any justice for these years. And they called us, and in fact, when we gathered there, they said precisely this. They actually said that when one young woman was raped on the streets of Delhi, all of India lit candles in her memory. What about us? It's been 22 years. So I recognize both our capacity for empathy, but also the limits to our empathy, the barriers to our ability to care. And I wrote about it. But I wrote further about these limits. Perhaps one will acknowledge. But is there the possibility of empathy with those who committed the crime of rape? Empathy, not justification, but empathy. You're shaking your head. Yes. to some reports, contradicted later, was the most cruel of the lot. Boy of 17 was actually came in as a street boy at the age of around 13 onto the streets. I worked with street kids, and the story was almost identical. He had extreme violence in his house. His father was very violent. There was extreme poverty, no hope. And he came into the city like many street boys. And I have, I've worked with about 300 street kids in Delhi who call me Papa, and many, I use supposedly much larger things, but perhaps that's my life's most significant accomplishment. But these children can call me Papa. And when I hear their stories, and these are kids who were, many of them in their adolescent ages were actually into heavy crime, the same kinds of stories of extreme violence in their homes, alcoholic fathers, coming onto the streets, surviving somehow. But what I've learned with them is how much it is possible to reclaim them. And it's been 6 or 7 years, and some of them are young adults. We're still holding on to them, we can study, pass them. The ability to heal, to forgive, to restart life, to study, to pass class 10, board exams, class 12. One of the boys, we were getting into the art and social sciences in Istanbul. And it has, that experience has confirmed to me how love can heal and reclaim. And so my point was that when that boy came out onto the streets at the age of 13, I didn't reach out to him. No, you didn't reach out to him. No one did. The state did not. And all he encountered was cruelty and violence and hatred. And if he became the monster that he did, my point is he alone responsible for what he became? Or are we complicit in his crime? Sometimes I ask myself if, I imagine, suppose I was reborn 100 years later, and I was sitting down and trying to write a history of our times today, of my own country, but really about the world. How would I describe India today and its middle class? Incidentally, the word middle class is actually a misnomer. We call ourselves the middle class, but we're not in the middle. We're really talking about the top, the side or two, but we sort of legitimize ourselves a bit by describing ourselves as the middle class. I would, if I was writing that history, I think there are two things that define the middle class most for me. The first is its indifference to injustice and suffering around. I call it the exile, if it were, from our conscience and our consciousness. Our enormous capacity to see suffering and to be able to look away. And whether inequality has grown empirically over the last, since I was a child, since India became free, can be debated. It really it's a difficult thing to measure, and by many measures, the Gini coefficient, etc. India is an unequal country, but not the most unequal of countries in the world. But to me, whether inequality has increased over since I was a child in empirical terms is not the point. What has changed is the normative framework within which this inequality is located. What has changed is, in simple words, the sense that this inequality is alright. It is at least inevitable, if not actually highly justified. There's a scholar called Akhil Gupta. He's done an interesting calculation about the number of people who die in India every year of entirely avoidable causes. Just of hunger, the absence of health care, poor water, and so on. And he comes up with a very conservative figure of 2 million people. Like 2 million people dying every year, and it's bigger than any tsunami or earthquake or all natural disasters put together. The point is that if at least 2 million people are dying of entirely avoidable causes every year, why does it cause more outrage? And really there is a certain normalization of poverty. It's as if there are hills and mountains and rivers and forests and poverty. It's always been there, it's part of the landscape. It was there, it is there, it will remain. And so what? It is that same absence of outrage that I'm talking about. Chomsky had come to India once and he was traveling with someone in the car, and he kept noticing that she would be looking out of the window. And he writes that, he says that poverty is manifested most dramatically in India, from anywhere else in the world. But that Indian people of privilege have developed this capacity to see and not see. To see and not register. I feel that, as I said, it has changed a great deal since I was a child. I was born in 1955. It was 8 years after India's independence. A great deal was wrong, but there was still a certain degree of egalitarian and secular idealism that survived in those times. And small things, I recall the first time I got a new set of clothes was when I was 8 years old. And it's still a memory in my head. Because after that, before that, we used to always just wear old clothes that were handed down. And we weren't poor, my father was. but it was just a way of, and even those old clothes actually used to be marched. Even after wearing them after a year, there was a shop called Eighth Wonder. Eighth Wonder was like the tailor would open out those clothes and the faded portion would go inside and the inside portion would come out and they again looked like new clothes and again you had to wear them. Your mother would tell you don't waste food, there are hungry children outside. I was talking about this in a meeting actually with which Indian Bill Gates have called of India's richest people, and we're talking about giving. I was talking about this, and Asim's wife actually came to me afterwards and said it was really true. And she was talking about her own childhood. She said that she came from a wealthy home. And she used to be driven in a car to school. And she used to feel so embarrassed about it that she used to stop the car a couple of blocks away and then walk, pretending that she was also walking to school like all the other children. And today you would want to show your flashy car as prominently as possible. There is a normative change that has taken shape. It was considered vulgar to display your wealth. Today, India's richest man has built a 27-story house, the most expensive house in the world, in a city where 200,000 people sleep homeless on the streets. And we regard it as glamorous and wow. And that's the kind of change normative framework that I'm talking about. And I think that talking about India and its middle class, where is this normative framework coming from? And I think that somewhere there's like a convergence between not one but not two but three systems which justify inequality in our collective consciousness. The first of them is the idea of caste, that legitimately where you are born should determine your life, opportunities and chances and direction. That's a legitimate idea. That's the idea of caste. So we have the Indian idea of the caste system, then you have the British class system, which had its own snobbishness and the idea of old wealth and good wealth and so on. And then you had this new idea, call it the American idea, call it the Thatcher and Reagan idea. But it was the idea that greed is good, that let's give up the socialist guilts of the past. There's nothing wrong with making money and enjoying and spending it. And so there's this, I think there's a convergence of all of these three in the social class to which most of us belong. Even middle class has forgotten, I think it's particularly passing through a phase in its evolution, is particularly uncaring, because it has forgotten our old ways of giving. There were strong cultural ways that we had learned to give and share. We've forgotten those and we haven't learned the new. So we've forgotten the old and we haven't learned the new. And there are many examples of older ways of giving, but one that I find perhaps the most attractive is the idea of the langar. The idea of the langar actually came up, the Sikhs picked it up, but before the Sikh Gurus, it was actually brought in by Nizamuddin Chishti, by the Sufis. And what is the idea of the langar? The idea of the langar was basically the idea, it wasn't just a community feeding program. It wasn't a food charity. It was much more than that. It was about how you did it. And that you had to offer food to somebody who was hungry and in need with respect, with cheerfulness. You treated that person like a guest. You sat him or her alongside yourself and you ate together. You respected that person's dignity. And you almost felt a sense of privilege that mutually you were sharing. And that idea of the langar is told in many ways, but there's a beautiful story told about Akbar, who had come to meet one of the gurus and gave his journey, and they said, no, you have to sit down in the langar first. And he sat, and there were beggars and the poorest people alongside, and Akbar was happy eating the same food with them. That was basically, and these were radical ideas of fraternity, of equality, of social collective caring. They were radical ideas in the 13th century when Nizamuddin Chishti originated them in the 16th century when Guru Nanak and others carried them forward. What is happening today? I decided to, in our work with the homeless, we decided to do a study of food charities in Delhi today. What is happening? And the findings were very interesting. Firstly, about the langar, what we found was that increasingly the gurdwaras are keeping out people who are manifestly very poor and destitute. The homeless are being kept out. Siskan Gurdwara, the biggest Gurdwara, stops them completely. In Gurdwara Bangla Sahib, they've now created a separate wing, which is outside the Gurdwara, where people can be seated separately. But that's not the langar at all. The idea of the separate seating breaks down the core idea of the langar. I wrote about this, and I'll also tell you about other religious traditions of food charity, what had happened to them. But when I wrote about the langar and its breakdown, I happen to actually have been, I'm born into a Sikh family, and so they were particularly unhappy. And everybody, I wrote about all the four religious, major religious traditions, everybody was extremely angry. So some of my uncles are part of some Gurdwara management. So they said that, you are a nephew when you wrote this, you brought us so much shame. And we had a meeting, and we'd like to explain to you why we made this change. Because I'd written, and in my article I also wrote about Akbar, and I've seen it's really ironical that it was actually India. But today, if the President of India decides to go and eat in Siskan Gurdwara, unlike Akbar, he would be deprived of the company of India's poorest people. And that's the story of democratic Republican India. So they explained to me, they said that you don't understand, these homeless people, they drink, they smoke, they are dirty. So they would make the temple impure by entering in. That is why we stopped them. So my answer was only that I have only one question in response. Was the poor different during the times of Guru Nanak? And if he felt that they did not make the temple impure, then what has happened today? Tulsidas, who wrote the Ramcharitmanas, he had a big standing battle with the Brahmins, and because he wrote in the language of ordinary people. So in one of his dohas, he's responding to the Brahmins, and briefly he says, I'll beg for my food. Do what you like to me, I'll beg for my food, and I will sleep in the mosque. Very interesting. He says, I'll sleep in the mosque. It meant that the mosque was a place where homeless people were welcomed in of all faiths to sleep and be taken care. And because he spent a lot of his time in Ayodhya, I like to believe that he must have slept at the Baltimore Masjid itself. One of the densest populations of homeless people is around the Jama Masjid in Delhi. About 10,000 people sleep there. And often I look up and look at the Jama Masjid and I wish that the managers of the Jama Masjid would remember what the mosque was supposed to be. In this same study that we did of what is happening to religious food charities in Delhi. So I told you about the langar. We found, to my shock and surprise, I found there wasn't a single Christian food charity in Delhi. And selling Christian food, and again I've written about each of these, and each have not been cultivated. About the Hindu feeding, the current Hindu feeding traditions, what the homeless said was very interesting. They said that the trouble with it is that they give what they want to give when they want to give. So Saturday is a holy day, or Tuesday is a holy day, and on that day they will come and distribute, say, sweet, oily stuff. But we don't want that sweet and oily stuff. We want sort of basic, nutritious food, and we want it regularly, and we want it served with dignity. But they're not interested in what we want. They're interested in what they want to give. And so the indifference of that giving to the receiver was a very profound feedback. And likewise in the Muslim traditions it also broken down. In fact, but still the best traditions that we found were in some of the Muslim ghettos in Dynasty, where you can, when you go into one of the eating places, the dharbas, you can also buy tokens of 20 rupees and 30 rupees, which you then give to a destitute person, and that person can then claim it when he or she needs it. And so that seemed to me the best surviving tradition that we could find. But why I'm talking about this in some detail is that when I say the middle class has forgotten these old ways of giving, that we were culturally taught to share and give as part of a good life, of good living. We've forgotten those. But we haven't learned, we don't have, there's soup kitchens. The US is not a great example, but if you go across the European countries, there are ways that you don't want to go through old religious traditions, there are other ways of engaging, which we haven't absorbed adequately. And therefore, we are in this particularly uncaring moment of our development. And I'll give you a few examples of, just as illustrations, of how this manifests itself in public life and public debates. The most recent was the debates that arose around the food bill. And I was originally asked to speak about the food bill. There are many things that are wrong with it. I was associated with its writing. I value the core idea of it hugely. I recognize many of its flaws, but that's a different discussion. But what was really what I was unprepared for was the degree of vociferous middle class rage against the food bill. And I was on television debates night after night after night during that time, and everybody, including the anchor, was sort of furious with the idea that you're having this program where the state is taking responsibility to use taxpayers' money to provide cheap food to 800 million people. And there was anger about that. And I said, it's outside today's discussion, and what is wrong with the bill, what is good in the bill as it is designed, is a matter that there are legitimate debates and discussions that we can have. But here, this hit something which is much more raw. And in one of these debates, for instance, Kevin Mazumdar's show, who is one of our much more enlightened leaders of the industry. I was with her on this debate, and she at one point turned around and she actually said something that I was completely shocked by. She said, the rich have earned their money through hard work. The rich have done nothing to harm the economy. Why should we then be taxed to feed the poor? I think, she would have been more measured, but the degree of, the emotional anger was so much that she actually said this. And I had to turn around and say that I'm sorry, but you would agree that the poor also work hard, probably much harder. You would agree that the poor have done even less to harm the economy. And in a good society, people of wealth and means are happy to share some of that wealth to ensure basic decent life for people who are less fortunate. But there was, at the heart, this rage, and the extent of that rage in public discourse started. Somebody like Gushan Das made another point, which I must confess enraged me. He said that we should not have this because it will disincentivize work. Now, let's sort of explain that. What he's basically saying is that if poor people have a few more rotis in their stomach or a little more rice in their stomach, they just stop working. Which means that this other species who have no dreams for their children, who want a better life, they're hungry today, you just feed them and they don't stop working. I've chosen to do a lot of work with very, very poor people, and they're just beings exactly like you and me. They might be sleeping on the streets, they might be destitute, but they also love their children. They have also dreams of a better life, and ensuring that they don't sleep hungry is not going to make them stop working. There's also, of course, whether we can afford the costs, and in my mind, there's the question of, the more important question is, what are the costs of not doing it? What is the cost of every second child being Bangladesh? Even when we are the second fastest growing economy in the world. In fact, that all these years of economic growth has not changed that basic reality. And we're really benefiting from our demographic development, we are told, which means that we have the largest youthful working population in the world. But if every second child is Bangladesh, it means that every second person in that demographic dividend, the body and their brains are not formed to full potential. And if they lack education, they lack decent housing, then we're losing, and healthcare, we're actually losing half the potential of our most important economic resource. I can make that argument, but I don't want to in defense of the food bill, because it seems to say that people should be valued only insofar as they are economic agents. So we should value people only insofar as they either produce or consume. But what about people then who cannot produce and cannot consume? So old people, for instance. And I think that we have to come back to the deeper moral argument about the good society and the good state. And what is our imagination of it? A second example of this manifestation of middle class indifference is education. We had hoped and dreamed that education, spread of education, is fundamental to building a more egalitarian, democratic India. But we actually created an education system which completely mirrors the inequalities of society. So where you are born determines what kind of education you are going to get, if at all, and that will determine your future. So if the richest people now would be studying abroad, slightly less rich people would be studying in fancy air conditioning. And now it's really, you're actually getting into an air conditioning school bus, and getting an air conditioning classroom, your food comes from fancy air. The only thing they're not air conditioning yet is the playgrounds, but I think that's only a matter of time. And then you have to go down, and so low middle class kid in urban area would be going to a clubbing school with motivated teachers and poor infrastructure, and then if you got born in a village, you finally end up with one teacher for 5 classes, who sometimes comes and sometimes doesn't. And if you are homeless street kid, then you never see the inside of the school. And so we actually have an education system which completely mirrors and reinforces inequality rather than challenges them. But the Right to Education Act came, and again, this is not a place that I want to debate its strengths and weaknesses. But one of its actually very modest provisions was that in the elite schools of the wealthy, 25% of the seats in the entry class, very small children, should be reserved for disadvantaged children. Extremely modest provision. The amount of anger and resistance that the elite schools had, they pooled, and even those which call themselves progressive, Rishi Valley and many others, pooled a huge amount of money employed some of the country's most expensive lawyers for a battery of them to challenge this provision in the Supreme Court. And I looked carefully at their arguments in the debates at that time, and I found an uncanny, eerie similarity to the kinds of debates that the United States saw in the 1960s during desegregation of schools at that time. And the arguments were almost identical. There are three kinds of arguments that were made now and were made then. The first of them was that, actually we're really concerned about the disadvantaged child or the black child in the United States context. But we're sure that child is not going to be able to adjust and integrate. So for her sake or his sake, we want segregated schools. So, so let's go out, we go to the slum, we go into the village somewhere, we create separate schools for them. But it's not good for them to come into our school. The second kind of argument that was made was even more pernicious, which was that the merit of our schools is going to be diluted by the entry of these poor children. Which means that we are people of privilege, you and me, are intrinsically the people who have merit. And people out there, people who do not have the privilege that we have, also don't have the merit. Now, how are you going to compare the merit of a child who is born into one of our homes, who has everything that she needs, has educated parents, she needs a tutor, she gets exposure, goes to the best schools, everything of hers is secure, she gets up in the morning and before people are eating her breakfast, which is expected, she goes to school. You have this girl, her same age, living in a slum, in capacities, the 10 siblings, one room, neither of her parents are educated, she doesn't have any place that she can study, mosquitoes, dirt, she sleeps, she has to get up at 4 in the morning, bathe in an open tap, prepare food for her younger siblings, get ready somehow, get into a crowded bus, reach a municipal school where the teacher is not interested. And then you have a street girl who will be sleeping under the open sky, sexually abused through the night, picking rags, never seeing the inside of the school. How do you compare the merit of the two? And then to claim that the entry of these children are going to damage merit. And the third, again, in both these contexts, the third kind of argument was that it's not the business of government, it's the business of business is business. And as if there's no difference between setting up a school and selling soap or something. And we're frankly for profit, and if the government wants the poor to be educated, then let them do something about it on their own. So these were the arguments that were made, and fortunately, after a long battle in the Supreme Court, it was upheld, the act, and now these children are entering for the first time. There's this news commentator on NDTV called Sonia Singh. I think one of the nicest comments on all of this I read from her. She wrote a piece. She said, "I'm not writing this as a journalist nor as any kind of expert on education. I'm writing as the mother of a 5-year-old boy, in the first class where this new provision is being enforced. So luckily, these kids are of such a young age that they are not overly influenced by the prejudices of their parents and making their own choices. And then she wrote that she went to the first parent teacher meeting after, and you could easily spot who were the parents of the disadvantaged children. And she went to one of the fathers and said, how are things going now? So he said, not bad, it's going okay, but whose problem has arisen? So she asked what, he said that there's a birthday party. So, why is that a problem? The school has this rule that, all children have to be invited, and this rich kid has invited my son, and he's so excited. So why is it a problem? So he said the problem is who's going to accompany this child. He said that they're they're very small kids, they can't go on their own. So either their parent accompanies them, or their domestic help accompanies them, the ayah. Now, when they go in, the parents are seated in one place, the ayahs are seated in another. When his mother goes, is she going to be seated with the parents? Or is she going to be seated with the ayahs? And as is most likely, she's going to be seated with the ayahs. What is my son going to feel? And I really found it a story that moved me a lot, because I think that we have to begun, at least can we make a classroom one where children of diverse backgrounds are able to study together and make friends. And ultimately the opposition, this fierce opposition to this provision, to this very modest provision, is ultimately because we could not bear the idea that my child and my domestic health child, and maybe a street child, could actually be sitting on the same bench, studying together, might even become friends. And most frighteningly, maybe my domestic health child will actually perform better than my own. We as a society are not yet ready for it. In fact, one principal of Sriram School, where my own daughter had studied, I think in a weak moment of the record, she was speaking to a journalist, and Wall Street Journal or something, one of the American newspapers. And he published what she said, and she said that the woman who's mopping my floor, if she turns around and sits across the table from me as a parent tomorrow, I can't take it. That's what she said. So that's the second example of what our comfort level with inequality, the society that we have produced. A third is, and I can go on. The third I really talk about is healthcare, especially standing here in Hopkins. India is an extraordinary example of a country where you say you should be spending about 6% of your GDP on healthcare, and the United States is of course having its own turbulent debate around same questions. India spends, the public spending on healthcare is just 1% of GDP, and 2% of GDP is actually additionally spent on healthcare by out-of-pocket private expenditure. Now, think of what that means in a very poor country, where 600, 700, 800 million people are very poor. even in my childhood, I remember that at least you could go to a public hospital. Even I used to, most of us used to go to public hospitals, and you would get free treatment. You would have to sit in line, whatever would happen. But today, if you're poor, there's actually, you virtually have no option except to sometimes just die. And my own parents, the last 3-4 years, have been extremely unwell and have been in and out of hospitals. And my mother just passed away last month, but she survived for 3 months. And I often thought that if I was poor, my parents would have died. And is that an acceptable situation? Again, my work with homeless people and street kids, I find that sometimes these very small children are abandoned, and you think that you wonder why they've been abandoned, and you discover that they have some serious health problem, and their parents have perhaps given them up because they just simply cannot. There's nothing you can do about it. Suppose your kid has cancer and you're poor. There's nothing you can do about it. And that is something that we have tolerated. We've tolerated in this country, we've tolerated it in mine. For too long. And it isn't a moral discourse that we are having. I read the story recently of there was this character on television, this young girl of about 8 or 9 was completely devastated because her father was trying to drown her. And she was saved at the last minute. And she couldn't believe, she couldn't understand, because he was a very loving father, and why was he trying to drown her? Then it turned out, he said that she had a kidney broken down. And for 2 years, everything that he had invested in her treatment. And she had 5 or 6 other brothers and sisters. And it reached a point when he said that, either it was her or everybody else. And he finally decided that the only option was to drown her. There's the last example that I would give would be of our domestic health. Again, I was reading another novel called The Help, which I think many of you might have read, set in the 1960s in the South of the United States. And reading that book, I was, it was about how badly domestic health was treated in this country, in the southern states in the 1960s. And I really felt, in many ways, in Delhi today, domestic health is treated much worse. The whole debate, the whole point of tension in the novel is about that one of the employers decides that the domestic help cannot share the same toilet as the owners of the house, and she builds a separate toilet. In how many of our homes does the domestic help use the same toilet that ours? Or that they aren't allowed to sit on the same. They sit on the same dining table and eat, but they eat at a separate time. Think of the stories in middle class India today, and where would the domestic health sit? And it strikes me sometimes that how a child at a very young age learns inequality. uh, you say, "Bete sab badon ke paanch wo," touch the feet of all the elders. 4-year-old boy is told. Why does he touch? He knows that he has to touch everybody's feet, but not the feet of the domestic. How does he know that this is one older person that you can speak to as a command, whom you don't have to give the same respect to? How does he learn it so early? That's where, when I started off, where this normative framework of the legitimacy of inequality manifests itself. And these are the laboratories where we learn it. And perhaps India's greatest shame, I think, is the employment of children as domestic help. That you can actually, have your own child, school bag being carried by another child almost his age, and one child goes to school and one child comes and sweeps the floors. As I work with in these kids, as I said, some of these kids, this little girl, one of them had told me she was rescued by the police. She was about 8 years old, and she said that her mother, the very poor, her mother had sent her. She was working as a domestic help in somebody's house. One day the employer got furious with her and simply turned her out. 8 years old, and she was wandering the streets. And luckily, a kind policeman saw her and picked her up and rescued her in some way. And there's this great hostility to people who live, say, in slums. We are outraged that these people are dirtying our city. They should be stopped. Firstly, most of us are migrants ourselves. But we can legitimately come into the city, but a poor person should not be allowed to. We have a city which does not plan affordable housing spaces for the poor. So they make do where they can, how they can. And then we blame them for that situation. When the counter gains happen, it was really extraordinary because there was this sudden desire to, and I was driving a couple of weeks before the driving to work as usual, and suddenly I found that the slums that I used to pass by, there was suddenly those big posters of this smiling tiger cub icon and all sorts of things, and they really just hidden the poor. Speaking, the same thing happened in London before the Olympic Games. And the homeless, because you can't even hide them because they just too manifest, were actually put into trucks and vans and pushed into trains, and they actually put marks on their wrists, stamped their hands, so that they go away for 15 days and cannot come back. So I think that there, I often, I've been fighting hard for changes of public policy, for greater justice. But in the end, I do realize that that greater justice is not going to come until we believe that in that justice, and we can believe it when we have empathy. and where we have to extend our capacity for empathy to people who we don't see to be like us. So the extreme example of where this empathy breaks down, where we're able to see another human being, not as a human being like us. During the Gujarat violence, after that, there was a journalist called Ashish Khaitan who spent 6 months, he was to be a sympathizer of the right wing. And he entered there and said, use this new camera. You should watch some of that. And in another context of hate and so on. But one of the most terrifying of those is a video. There's this guy called Suresh. He's a Bajrangan fellow. His wife is sitting next to him, and he is describing in with great pride about how he's raped Muslim women, and his wife is nodding in great approval. And he also describes that after his rape, how he sort of smashes them to death and so on. And his wife is, is expressing satisfaction. And that, why that video really hits me hard is that, how she's a woman, and the ability to endorse the rape and murder of another woman only because of her religious identity is only possible when she no longer looks at her as a human being, as a woman like her. And I think the importance of reclaiming that understanding that actually none of us in this room are here because we are the best and we deserve to be here. All of those of you who are from India, if 1 billion people in our country have the same life chances as you and I have, I wouldn't be here. You have to decide whether you would be here or not. And if you are here only because of your privilege, at least let us have the humility to accept that we are not here because of our entitlement. We are not here because of our merit. We are here because life's dealt us a set of cards which another person does not have. And if they're sort of surviving somehow, they're coping, at least don't sort of, at least let us recognize that they're just another set of human beings like we. I teach a course the last few years in IIM Ahmedabad, and they invited me. So instead of an exam at the end of the course, I asked them to go out onto the streets and learn about the life of one homelessness. And it's, they've been really struck because, there's a red brick wall, and just on the other side of it, there are a number of homeless people who sleep. And they've lived there, they've studied there for 2 years, you hang out there, you walk there 100 times. You never even looked at the person who's the homeless person there. It's never struck you. Sitting down and actually having a conversation with them, suddenly they realize that here's actually just somebody who's in that little space. He has a sense of a home, he has children, he has dreams for them, he struggled against a really hard life, nobody's helped him, but he's just another human being. It could have been me, it could have been you, in another place, in another time. And I think that the middle class needs to reclaim its capacity for empathy. Chomsky talked about social protection. What is social protection mean? He said that the idea of social protection is ultimately simply the idea that we should take care of each other. He goes on to say, but we're living in times where that idea is seen as an extremely dangerous and subversive idea, which needs to be crushed at all costs. And I find that all the time. I work, I was part of the National Advisory Council, I work on public policy, I speak. But all I'm really saying is let's care for each other. And it's seen as you're like some left-leaning Maoist. Narendra Modi actually called me a Maoist 2 times in his public speeches. I happen to be extremely opposed to Maoist violence. But all I'm really saying is, everybody deserves a certain floor of dignity. And we're living in a world today where we have enough wealth, enough resources, enough food to ensure that no one should sleep hungry, no one should have to sleep under the sky, no one should die because they don't have health care. Is that something that is that so radical and revolutionary and subversive an idea for our time? Or is it the most elementary aspiration of the human collective that we need to reclaim? And I'll end with, because I've chosen to work on hunger, homelessness, and with survivors of violence, I spend a lot of my time with the most disadvantaged of our people. And I keep recognizing observing how they understand this much more instinctively than us. I was in Juhapara, and there was this woman again victim by the violence, and she lost everything. She was living in this one room, and my colleagues were sitting with her. A fakir came. A fakir is a Muslim beggar, and she took out 5 rupees and she gave it to him. And when he left, she started weeping. And my colleagues felt that they must have said something that would realize. And they asked her what was, and when she finally explained, she said, before the riots, I would not have let this fakir go. I would have given him at least 50 rupees, and I would have sat him down and given him a meal. And when I heard that, I felt that, her most profound sense of loss was not what she lost for herself, but she had lost her capacity to give and care. There was, in the same violence, I read lots of stories that I've told about with that. I can tell you stories of extreme brutality. But one thing I've learned is that for every person who killed and raped and plundered, there are at least 3 who, from the same community, who saved lives at great risk, and we never talk about them. So I heard about this illustratively, this one village, they said, the Muslims have told us that 110 of us were given shelter for 10 days by this farmer in his house. And I thought he must be some rich landlord, so I want to go see him and talk to him. I discovered he was just a small farmer and a very modest guy. And they said that their houses had been burnt and they were hiding in the fields, etc. It became night, and the children were hungry. They knew he was a compassionate person, so they decided to take a chance. They went to his door and said, "Can you let us stay for one night?" And he said, without hesitation, he said, "Not one night, for as long as we need to be here." And the whole state was burning around the village. hatred. There's this guy and his wife. They opened up, they had this store of grain for the year, so they opened that up. He collected his entire joint family. So the men used to stand for 10 days and 10 nights. They stood around and held guard. The women were cooking food through the day and night. And they said that even after 10 days, they insisted that, how long can we stay here? There are relief camps. Let us go there. And they insisted. And even then he used to go there and he used to see their children, he used to eat. And so when I sat with him and his wife and I said that, why did you do this? He was quite embarrassed. He was not able to understand why I was making such a fuss. And then at some point he said, how could I bear it that people of my village were treated in this way? And then he added, this village belongs to the Muslims as much as it belongs to me. And I was longing at that time to hear my own colleagues and friends say that this country belongs to the Muslims as much as it belongs to us. I then said, you must have at least been frightened, because actually I forgot to say that they also they kept threatening them, and they set fire to his fields and set fire to a portion of the house. So I said, at least you must have been frightened. So his wife at that point got really irritated with me, and she said, and she simply said, when you're doing the right thing, how can you be frightened? So I really didn't know what to, how to respond. And then finally I said, okay, but you lost your entire year's stock of grain. At least that must be a source of some regret. And he said, no, not at all, because my Thakurji is a Hindu deity to whom we worship. He said, Thakurji ensured that my grain stocks were never empty after that. And I felt that he had no doubt that his Thakurji would take care of him because he saved 110 Muslim people. He had no confusion. He had no doubts. The last story I can tell you about empathy is I work with, as I said, with homeless people, and on winter nights, temperatures go down to about 1 degree. And people have to actually hire blankets. There's a whole set of entrepreneurs who actually hire out blankets for about 50 rupees a night. That's a lot of money, and homeless people have to actually make a choice between whether they have a blanket and sleep, or they just freeze through the night, or they have their evening meal. But I noticed, in one of these night outs, that there are very old, destitute people, homeless, mentally ill women, and so on and so forth, who always had blankets. So I said, how come? How did they get their blankets? So they said, no, but we, very matter of fact, we know that if they didn't get their blankets, they would die. And so, when we gather in the evening, all the able-bodied homeless people, firstly what they do is that they pool money to hire blankets for the old and the destitute money. Then if there's money left, then they'll think about hiring blankets for themselves. And I thought that what government should be doing is not doing, what NGOs should be doing and not doing, what entrepreneurs should be doing and not doing. India's most destitute, dispossessed people are doing, and they're doing it as it is, it's the most natural thing to do in the world. And therefore, India will change, the US will change, the world will change. I think if we begin to just reclaim that extremely revolutionary idea that a good society is one where we take care of each